Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Mentes Sin Fronteras, Mind Without Borders. And today we have Shannon Palmer, who is a registered dietitian. So excited to have you with us today and talking about something I'm really passionate about as well, which is how food and nutrition influences our mental health. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
So, Shannon, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself because all they know at this point is that you're a registered dietitian.
Yes, that is true. I am a registered dietitian. I have a background in biology and nutrition, and sports nutrition specifically is what I ended up getting my master's degree in. Since then, I've been practicing for, I guess it's actually like 5 years officially. I just had my 5 year anniversary of getting my RD, so pretty cool. But yeah, since then, I do a little bit of everything, really. I work a lot with athletes still. I work a lot with our shared clients that we have in the eating disorder space. A lot of them are former athletes.
Mhm.
And I also am a nutrition professor. So I do a lot of teaching in my personal practice, but I enjoy working with really anyone, anyone that's willing to learn and prepared to make some hopefully positive changes to their nutrition.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations on your 5-year mark. And I'm sure you've
Yeah.
helped a ton of people, probably hundreds. So, and to many.
It's been a lot.
So we'll go ahead and dive in. I know you mentioned that you work a lot with athletes, former athletes, eating disorders, disordered eating. What really inspired you to kind of pick that niche?
Um, Honestly, my own background, I would say I've always been an athlete, and then I got really into the lifting and power sport space,
Mhm.
competed in strongman, for the past 5 years as well. And I had some instance of disordered eating in my own personal life, especially when I was in college. And it was kind of just through like lack of education and really understanding like what it means to fuel yourself and how to be a better athlete with nutrition. So a lot of that kind of stemmed my interest in helping other people. And not only that, I have a personal, heart condition that I've had since I was born. So I have to also approach nutrition from like a little bit of a clinical aspect for myself. So I started combining all those things and found people that also needed those kind of things combined for their nutrition and exercise, so that's really how I took off into that space. And unfortunately, a lot of athletes do struggle with disordered eating and eating disorders. So it was kind of like a natural combination for me.
Hmm. Yeah, and your story, right, and your own experiences fueled your desire to help others. And I know you and I have had a lot of conversations about how we really can't escape diet culture, and more more than not, there's someone out there, right, that is struggling with disordered eating, right, or just not having the best relationship with food. And so that's where you come in. And a lot of people may think, oh, a registered dietitian, I'm only going to work with them in a hospital setting, or if I have, diabetes, or if my doctor referred me to someone, right? But you
Mhm.
work with all different types of people and presenting concerns. So, like you mentioned, athletes, some of my patients, right? And what do you think? And I know I'm kind of jumping a little bit here, but what do you think is the number one misconception when it comes to just outpatient registered dietitian services?
Yeah, I would say that it's hands off. Like a lot of people think that dietitians are just gonna like hand them a plan and then say like, see you later, good luck. I think it's also people tend to think that it's going to be a very restrictive type of plan that they're putting you on, with weight loss as being like the only thing you need to see a dietitian for. And that is definitely not the case, right? We offer a lot more than just like
Mhm.
here's what to eat, here's what not to eat. So a lot of it is just that conception that, okay, I need to lose weight, then I see a dietitian. But really, like, that's kind of like the last thing that I am working with a lot of people on is that like weight loss per se. A lot of it is like behavioral patterns, again, fueling for athletes and just general, life. And a lot of it is, preventative care. And so it's not like, oh my gosh, I have this. Now what do I do? It's like, how can I prevent these things from getting worse? Or how can I manage my symptoms better? Or how can I combine, being an athlete or competing with a desk job where I am not getting that much, activity? How do I eat for my needs, basically?
That's awesome. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is very diverse, right? And you can have different presenting concerns, and it doesn't need to necessarily be a medical condition, right? So like you said, someone that has a more sedentary lifestyle, how can they best nourish themselves? Or maybe someone that has a very highly active lifestyle, like, a D1 athlete in college. So that's awesome.
Yep.
I hope that someone listening today is going to feel inspired to make an appointment, right? Not even just with you, but with any registered dietitian, right? Because I really do see it as a part of our overall like well-being, especially pairing it with therapy, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So, can you explain the connection between what we eat and how we feel mentally and emotionally?
Sure. I mean, mental health, is such a like complex issue. And food is definitely one of the things that can make it worse or make it better, right? Depending on, of course, like eating patterns and what we're eating. Anything internal is going to impact like your whole body, right? So what you're eating, how consistently you're eating, we can impact our neural pathways with what foods we have, our gut biome, inflammation, energy, sleep, all of those things are going to really, really have an impact on your mental state and emotional state, right? If you're eating, a pretty good quality diet and you're eating consistently, you might not have kind of that additional factor of, dysregulation going on, especially if you already have a mental health condition. So a lot of those things internally are going to most definitely impact like how you feel about yourself, how you feel about your environment, and either make your, mental health, emotional state worse, better, right? Or just more regulated or not.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And of course, there's all these different factors that apply to our mental well-being, right? Especially if we're dealing with something like depression or anxiety or PTSD, for example. I like to explain it to my patients, like in the therapy room, right? Of, okay, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We need our basics for our foundation. How can we really focus on anxiety management when we're not getting enough sleep, we're not nourishing ourselves, and we don't have shelter and we don't have safety? So, all of these things kind of compile on top of each other. So, what are
Yeah.
some common signs that a person's diet may be negatively impacting their mental health?
So I would say one, worsening of symptoms that you already have, right? If someone already has a diagnosed condition, paying attention to what symptoms they currently have and to what extent, and then if those symptoms are getting worse, that would, maybe be worth a look into the diet. In general, for people that, may not struggle as much with mental health, things like fatigue, anxiety, lower motivation, trouble concentrating, again, any worsening symptoms that you already have, if they're, suddenly getting worse or they've been gradually getting worse over time, I would be looking more into how diet and diet patterns can influence those symptoms.
Mm-hmm. So I know what I've been guilty of is my caffeine. So I have my Olipop here that has caffeine in it, but for someone like, for example, like waking up in the morning and having no breakfast and then having like a cold brew, right? And they struggle with anxiety, maybe it's some performance anxiety, for example, right before an exam, and they have a cold brew, heart
Right.
palpitations are going to start happening, and that's going to make it worse, right? So would you say that's an example of what you might see in someone's behavioral patterns that could be beneficial to change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, caffeine for straight on an empty stomach, one of the most common things that I see in my practice, right? But yeah, if you already have an inkling for anxiety, or you're already knowing you're having a stimulus that's going to give you anxiety, and
Mhm.
then adding something else that is a stimulus that will give you similar symptoms of anxiety, sure, that is definitely going to make that, worse for you, especially that day of. But yeah, anything that you already are kind of like noticing in your own life of like, okay, well, I'm not getting good quality sleep because maybe I'm having, an extreme amount of caffeine during the day to try to keep awake, to try to concentrate.
Mhm.
Those are all symptoms that we could probably improve by nutrition.
Mhm. Gotcha, gotcha. Okay, so there's a lot of fear around carbs. Now that we're talking about fatigue, I feel like it's the perfect time to kind of bring this in because it is the
Right.
body's main source of energy. Can you expand on that, on how cutting carbs can impact our energy and even anxiety?
Yeah, so I mean, carbohydrates are the buzzword, I would say, for, this era's diets trend. But very commonly, carbs are demonized and said, all these things will happen, you're gonna get fat, et cetera, et cetera. But carbohydrates are our body's preferred source of energy, like you said, right? So our brain and our red blood cells need glucose to function. So even if carbohydrates are low, we will find a way to produce glucose through different pathways because we absolutely need it, right? Carbohydrates, the most direct way to influence your blood sugar and also give your brain energy.
Mhm.
So when you are not fueling your brain directly, right, you're going to take a hit somewhere, right? You're not going to be at your most, cognitive function that you could possibly have.
Mhm.
You're going to see higher incidence of fatigue, brain fog, cravings usually tend to skyrocket when you try to cut carbs, especially very low. Mood swings, right? Being irritable is a very common sign as well.
Mhm.
So we often see like hormonal changes with that as well. Increased cortisol, increased adrenaline. If you've got low blood sugar, right? Those things are in place to help us try to regulate our blood sugar levels. So when we are purposely or sometimes not purposely cutting carbohydrates out of the diet, we tend to see like brain dysfunction and just general, mood irregularities happen because your brain is quite literally looking for nourishment.
Mm. And that makes sense. I want to bring in this cultural piece, right? Especially growing up in a Hispanic home. And of course, our podcast is for everyone, but I do, a lot of it is dedicated to Hispanic and Latinos. And one of the most common diet culture norms, I would say, at least for my lived experience, is, cutting carbs, right? And how rice is bad. And we did an episode with another awesome dietitian on just diet culture within the Hispanic community. So how do you integrate, right? Like if you are working with me, for example, and I'm Hispanic, how can you integrate these culturally rich foods that unfortunately that narrative has been don't eat rice, don't eat plantains, and gentrifying food, right? Eat kale salads or go to Bole for lunch instead of having pollo tropical, right? So what do you think about that?
Well, I'm a big proponent of just incorporating your cultural foods no matter what, right? I mean, if that is like something that brings you comfort and is an integral part of your culture, there's absolutely no reason for you to cut any of those out. I strongly believe that, portion sizes and what we pair with foods that may be a little bit higher in carbohydrates, for instance, that is going to have a huge impact on your blood sugar regulation and also things like fullness, right? Which tend to be something that will also trigger someone to overconsume, uh, you know, a tasty carbohydrate rich dish, right? So a lot of that is just portioning out things appropriately and then making sure we're generally having solid balanced meals to also counteract in case there was a situation where, yeah, we're gonna have a higher carbohydrate meal, but what did the rest of that day look like, right? So I don't believe in cutting things out. It's more of just reportioning things that are already part of your diet and making sure that we have a good balance of everything.
Awesome. Yes. I hope the one word that listeners get from today is balance, which I know that you're a big advocate for.
Yes.
So are there specific nutrients or food groups that are essential for mental clarity or emotional stability that you would recommend?
I'm always going to say there's no one magic food or one magic food group, right? Always balanced diet. That's always going to be, my go-to. But there are foods and groups of foods that can help improve, mental clarity, emotional state, right? A lot of the times we see increased inflammation with mental disorders. So foods high in antioxidants, fruits and veggies, right? Those can help to mitigate some of that inflammation, which may be causing exacerbated symptoms. So fruits and veggies, fiber intake to help with gut health. So we know, gut function, gut brain axis is a big one for, regulating mental and emotional state as well. So feeding that gut bacteria, prebiotics, probiotics, and then omega-3 fats. So omega-3 fatty acids are probably that one main food group that we know can directly help with brain function. And it's even been shown to help with depression, especially. So, especially when paired with a antidepressant. But in general, omega-3 is, nuts, seeds, fish, oil, those types of things are going to help possibly with specific mental disorders and then also just helping regulate inflammation and satiety.
Mm-hmm. And I love how you bring up inflammation. And I know I talk a lot with my patients that have PTSD or CPTSD, or just patients that have been exposed to a significant amount of trauma and them constantly being hyper aroused, right, or outside of their window of tolerance, and how nourishment is so important, and imperative with healing. And so I'm glad that that is something in the center of your practice. Now kind of getting into eating habits and mental states. So how can regular eating patterns, skipping meals, impact mental health? So skipping breakfast, for example, or maybe only eating one meal a day, maybe because someone's really busy or they've been told, oh, you should only eat one meal a day, right?
Right.
What about that?
I never recommend skipping meals, especially not breakfast, considering we are, coming off of a quote unquote fast, right? With breakfast, the word break the fast. So generally speaking, skipping meals, we're going to see a lot of blood sugar dysregulation, right? So a lot of ups and downs, especially if we're going prolonged periods without eating, and then maybe having like a very large meal to compensate for that, deficit. So we can get, again, feelings of like hangry, irritability, anxiety, those types of things. If we're, again, irregular food patterns, we just have poor energy, right? If you're skipping meals quite frequently, you're not going to have really good energy throughout the day, which in turn is going to impact your whole day, and, impacts your motivation, right?
Mhm.
Impacts your ability to do self-care things. If you
Mhm.
have no energy, like you probably don't feel like going and taking a walk in the sun, right? You probably don't feel like making food for yourself, more likely to go and maybe order food out or get it delivered, right? Stuff like that. So everything kind of cycles off of each other. Stress response is higher. Again, when you're not giving your brain food or your body food, that's a stressor on the body. So if you're already having high stress environment or other mental states that are increasing your stress, not eating or eating very irregularly is only going to contribute to those states. And then, of course, any disordered eating patterns, we're just putting ourselves at an increased risk for developing a more severe, eating disorder or very, tightly regulated eating and generally not going to be a good relationship with food following that.
Mhm. So what I'm hearing is not a recommendation, right? To wake up and
Definitely.
have your café con leche. I hope my abuela's hearing this. So it's a habit that I'm trying to work on her with, is to have some food before the café con leche. But Yeah, I definitely see that. And I think for me personally in college, I would have, coffee and then I would go to class and I didn't have time for food. And so then getting tired, having more caffeine in the afternoon. And again, like you said, we find ourselves in this cycle of dependency, right? And that's not fun. So even for myself, I know I'm not a morning person. So I have my own routine of like smoothies or just quick access foods because I know myself. And I think that's the biggest thing too that I work with my patients is having realistic expectations. And that's going to look different for everybody, So for someone that loves waking up in the morning and they're a morning person, their breakfast may look different, right? And that's okay. So awesome. So
Yeah,
what
definitely.
oh, go ahead, Shannon. Sorry about that.
No, I was just definitely breakfast is like the hardest meal for people. So I always am one to give like very quick and very convenient options that are going to still give you like a solid meal to start the day with. But yeah, breakfast is a tough one for most people.
Mhm. And I know that this podcast is not a replacement for medical advice or guidance, right? It's just for educational purposes, entertainment, right? But what are some common breakfasts that you recommend for someone like myself that is not a morning person at all, but needs to get their nutrition in?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, smoothies are a really good one if you have time to even just like freeze your smoothie ingredients and then just put them quick in the blender. I'm a big fan of like oatmeal. I think oatmeal is really solid to start the day with, high in fiber and it's very filling. And then getting a protein in there somewhere else. Yogurt bowls, that's a big one. I always recommend. It doesn't take much effort to scoop some Greek yogurt into a bowl and put some like granola and fruit on it and then off to the races. But anything that has a complex carb, a protein, and then usually fruit is with breakfast. But something again where you can just kind of have your boxes checked and
Mhm.
you're off to the day.
Awesome. Okay. So, what role does blood sugar play in mood swings, fatigue, or irritability? Because blood sugar, I think, is a really big buzzword right now in wellness culture and in diet culture. So, tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, everyone seems to be afraid of insulin nowadays, but generally speaking, for like a quote unquote healthy individual without diabetes, right? Because that's definitely a whole nother case. So we're gonna not touch on that too much, but generally speaking, right, your body doesn't like extremes. Okay, it doesn't like if your blood sugar is really high, doesn't like if it's super low. So anytime you're going out of that kind of like homeostasis range, you're going to have possible impacts to your mood and cognitive function, right? Low blood sugar is like very common, I would say, in terms of like actually seeing the cognitive effects, right? We have again brain fog, irritability, hangry, what I base my whole practice off of being hangry, and just generally not being in a good mood, right? And so that is again from kind of your brain having just no food, basically no energy, and it's trying to give you signs to eat something. And that's generally where we see people ignoring that function, right? And we can even see some things like headache or nausea that really are going to put you in a bad mood because no one likes a chronic headache or chronically feeling nauseous. And so all of those things can really impact your day to day. And then over time, right, if our blood sugar is very irregular, then we can see some more clinical signs come up of, the insulin resistance or prediabetes, diabetes, etc.
Hmm. Gotcha. Okay. And then can you speak a little bit about the mental health effects of restrictive dieting or chronic calorie restriction? Because I know you just noted that our body doesn't like extremes, right? It likes to be in the center, which is what we learn in therapy as well, right? Is emotional regulation and kind of living in that gray zone. So doing the same thing with nutrition. So what happens when we have someone who's chronically dieting, right? The yo-yo dieting of either keto or the carnivore diet or low fat. I mean, the list goes on. There's been a ton. So what happens with that?
I mean, depending on the diet, right, we're gonna have different impacts, but generally chronic dieting is I would say very detrimental to your mental health. And you can probably touch more on that than me. But in my own practice, chronic dieters, we've got really poor self-image, poor body image, higher rates of anxiety, depression, self-isolation. We have a lot of shame and guilt that comes up with chronic dieting or having rigid food rules, which I would say is in
Mhm.
the realm of dieting.
Mhm.
Again, if you're on a very restrictive caloric diet, you are, starving your body and your brain on multiple levels. It might not happen overnight, but we put ourselves at risk for malnutrition, right? And again, over time, that's when we see our body stores get depleted. We might not get all of our micronutrients in, right? Vitamins and minerals. If you're not eating enough food volume in general, it tends to be something that just stacks up very quickly of like, all right, well, we're not getting enough food in general, so we're not getting enough protein in. We're not getting enough micronutrients in. Again, we're not getting key nutrients such as like vitamin D, right? We're not seeing any of our nutrient stores be adequate because we're just simply not eating enough to get those things in. And so on top of that, it just becomes a very big stressor on that person. The
Mhm.
more you're chronic dieting, the more rules you have around nutrition, it tends to just stack up. And that is a huge stress on someone to be constantly thinking about, okay, I need to get, X, Y, and Z number of calories at this meal, or I can't have this food, or I can't go out to eat because there might be this food there, right? It
Mhm.
just tends to all like stack up very, very, subsequently with one diet starting, and then we start to get this kind of, again, rollover into the next
Mhm.
popular, whatever it ends up being.
Right, right. And the way I explain it too, just to kind of piggyback off of that, is we create a box, right? Like with all of these rigid rules that you were just listing off, we're constantly living in the future and also in the past, which takes away our ability to really be present in that moment. Because again, we're thinking, okay, if I'm eating this right now, then I ate that before, and then that's going to impact what I eat in the future. And then again, that anxiety starts to go up, which also affects our digestion, right? And doesn't make us feel good. And then it's harder to adapt, right? Okay, well, I have to go on a work trip. And now I'm thinking about all of these things that I have to do to keep my food rules, right? Or my diet. Or I want to go on this trip and now I'm stressed about what I'm going to eat or how my body's going to look. And then we kind of add in exercise, right? Of over exercising or exercising without proper nutrition. Talk about inflammation and irritability. Not good. So I'm glad that we touched on that. Awesome. So we're going to move into something we've already kind of covered, but just to kind of recap it, what are the physiological impacts of labeling foods as good or bad? This really also impacts it just overall like person, mental and physical health.
Yeah, I would say again, good and bad foods or any like polarizing language surrounding food is in my, professional opinion and in my practice is never going to lead to a good relationship with food, a healthy relationship with food, right? Um, that's very extreme. If this food is bad, right, what is making that food bad? A lot of the times there's not really a scientific basis for why that food is bad. It's a perception or a narrative that person has placed on that food. But when you're using polarizing language in general, right, but especially with food, it makes it very, very easy for you to start using that language on yourself. Um, if I am labeling this food as bad and for whatever reason I eat that food, now the internal process is, okay, I'm bad because I ate that, right? I am bad. Not just that food is bad. Now I'm bad because I ate it. So we see an increased, again, guilt and shame cycle
Mhm.
because of that labeling. And because a lot of the times what people label as bad, they taste good, right? That's generally the foods that they're being labeled as such. And a lot of the times trying to restrict those foods to such extremes that when they are, faced with that food, there's no regulation at all. and it's consumed in excess. And then again, we see, self-esteem, self-image tends to be like very negatively impacted by this perception that food is a moral entity.
Mhm. And how you mentioned, the all or nothing thinking, right? Which is a very common cognitive distortion that all humans we partake in, right? We're not perfect. And so, like you said, it starts to kind of spew into who we are, right? I'm bad, right? Or we always hear like, oh, I'm being naughty and I'm like having this dessert. I'm being bad. And it can be, at times like people may say it like as funny, but at other times, people really start to struggle with this. And I'll give you a comment and you can kind of expand on it. But when I've had these conversations with friends, I had someone say, so are you saying McDonald's is good for me and it's not bad food and I should eat it every single day? And what would you say to that if that was something that's come up? Because that's one of what my friend told me, right? And understandably so, when we're used to living in this pendulum swing of going back and forth.
Right. And I would say, no one is saying eat McDonald's every day. That's never, especially in nutrition world for dietitians, it's never what we're saying, right? We're saying that if you do eat McDonald's one day, we don't need to have this complete spiral of negativity that comes from that, right? We can accept that, okay, that was more of a processed meal that maybe didn't have a lot of nutrient density. And we can take that with a grain of salt, right? And move on, right? That doesn't say that we need to eat McDonald's every day because we don't have like good or bad foods, right? It's more or less just letting something like that, pass by you and not internalize it to such an extent that now the rest of your meals for that week are influenced by that decision or by that meal that you had that one day. So yes, that's something that that we see a lot of people like rebuttal for that. But no one is saying that, we should be eating these foods in excess, right? It's simply saying that like we don't want our mental state to be completely altered if we do have a food that's maybe out of our normal bounds.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. And a lot of the times too, we can't have this perfect like eating life, right? Or perfect nutrition. And there's going to be things like, unfortunately, hurricanes, right? Where we're not going to have access to refrigerated foods at times, right? If we lose power or we're on a road trip and all that's open is McDonald's. And I don't want to poo-poo on McDonald's, but I do prefer Chick-fil-A and PDQ. So sometimes I have to do the McDonald's if there isn't, a PDQ or a Chick-fil-A, and that's okay, right? And how you said not allowing it to dictate your mood, right? And how you view yourself. Because that's where we kind of see again that all or nothing mentality of, okay, well, I've already been bad, so I'm just going to go ahead and continue to be bad, right? And then that kind of leads down not a great path. So I appreciate you clearing that up because I'm sure it's what a lot of people are thinking when they first hear that. Um, how does disordered eating patterns, right? So like binging or rebound eating, extreme restriction, influence us in the long term? So, years and years and years of doing this, how does it really impact our body?
I mean, again, whenever you are having kind of what I would call irregular eating patterns, which we can say, binging or extreme restriction falls under that category, your body is under stress, right? It is stressed, not maybe, in the same way that you would perceive like a test coming up type of stress, right? But again, your body is being deprived of nutrients or it's consuming nutrients in excess, especially with binging. And all of that, will lead into physiological responses, right? Depending on what situation we have, whether it's extreme restriction or overconsumption, right? We see again negative implications for both. It's just depending on what one we're talking about. But mental health wise, again, you are either depleting your body of nutrients that we are using to help even, form, for instance, neurotransmitters that are going to directly impact our mental health, or we're under this, again, perception of ourselves of these, eating patterns are making our perception of ourselves usually worse. And having this like shame and guilt that is attached to food
Mhm.
is the biggest indicator that I would say of like going into the space of eating disorders.
Mhm.
If someone has that perceptual or the perception of, again, this food or what I'm eating is directly going to like make me look this one way, or I'm going to have this specific result from eating like this. So I do not have any wiggle room in the matter. Those are all going to lead into mental health spaces in terms of like both how you feel about yourself and then how your environment and how everything is also impacting you, right? The
Mhm.
more stressed you are internally, the worse your stress response is to your environment. So if you're
Mhm.
chronically stressed, internally, and you're putting that stressor also mentally of just having to think about food and, your diet, et cetera, all the time, you're going to probably have some dysregulation for like environmental stress, right? Which may or may not have impacted you otherwise, but we tend to see very heightened responses when we've got other kind of coexisting conditions with food patterns.
Mhm. I appreciate your insight, Shannon, and I know that we only have a couple minutes left, so I want to get to, practical tips to give listeners. And again, this is not a replacement for medical advice, and definitely if you're listening and this is resonating with you, you can make an appointment with Shannon, or you can make an appointment with another dietitian to really go into the specifics. But just in general, what are some accessible tips for people that are looking to improve their nutrition so that then in turn helps their mental health?
Tip number one, don't go extended periods without eating something, besides when you're asleep. So I would say, 4 hours is generally a good marker of, having a meal or snack after about 3 to 4 hours. It's going to help maintain your blood sugar within a preferred range, giving your body and your brain food for the day. And that one's pretty doable, whether or not that meal or snack is maybe ideal in my end of things. That's another conversation.
Mhm.
But at least having something meal or snack wise about every 4 hours to keep you consistent.
Mhm.
And then trying to have at least one fruit or vegetable with each meal. I would say that's another pretty solid starting point. Most people, we can have access to canned, frozen, fresh produce where it doesn't need to be just fresh. And that one's, again, going to help with your actual nutrient intake, but also increasing your antioxidant intake as well, which can help with your inflammation. Those would be probably the first two tips I would go with, and then always drinking enough water. We don't talk about hydration enough, but hydration does also impact your brain function. So those are probably the most accessible tips I would say to
Mhm.
start with.
Mhm. So with water, what would you say is a good baseline for someone that's starting to increase like how much they're drinking water a day?
Yeah, I mean, depending on where they start, I always say just add, if you're starting at 20 ounces a day, right? Try to increase by 20 ounces and go from there. But generally, I would say minimum for most people is going to be 60 ounces a day. And if you're doing a lot of sweating, you're going to need to be probably much higher
Mhm.
than that, but at least trying to hit a solid, 60 ounces would be a good starting point. But if you're having no water now, don't try to go from 0 to 60, right? Just try to, gradually increase that until you hit it and it feels okay. And don't chug your water either. Try to sip it throughout the day.
Mhm. Yeah, just like with everything, right? One little baby step at a time. It's not all or
Exactly.
nothing. Right, right. So, when do you find it's appropriate for someone to say, you know what, it's time for me to make an appointment with a dietitian, especially if they're going to a therapist? I mean, I always encourage my patients to consult with a registered dietitian. I do know there's barriers because of insurance, and just access to care in general. But if someone does have that access, what would be a reason to do that?
I say you don't really need a reason, quote unquote. I think everyone could benefit from having someone just do even like a checkup of what you are eating or what patterns of, eating you have. But especially if they have a mental health condition, mental health is not isolated. It's going to be impacted by, your environment, your social life, your intake of nutrients. So it's not just, one thing that one person can tackle alone. So I think even if you're already diagnosed or you have underlying concerns with your mental health, getting someone to even just have a solid, like I said, checkup of is if there's anything that we can change that could improve it, or at least improve energy levels, which tends to be something that we see that's very, significantly declined in someone that has a mental health condition. So I say every time, but I know that's just because I think it's very valuable information, and most people again might see something or learn something new that could help them, and they haven't even thought about that.
Mhm.
Like the water, for instance, that's one that most people don't think about, and one that makes a huge, huge difference. So.
For sure, for sure. Awesome. Well, last thing, you get to debunk one nutrition myth to wrap things up. So, which one did you pick?
Um, I mean, I would say the most, prevalent one now is that carbs are bad for you. So I always say, like no one food group is bad for you, and there always going to be patterns of like what society is dictating as like the next diet trend, right? Used to be low fat, now it's low carb. So there's always going to be something that is quote unquote demonized, and a lot of it is due to, money, right? If people are able to tell you that you have a problem and then sell you a solution to said problem, they're going to do it. So there's always going to be something that's like buzzword and people are writing books about, right? But no one food or no one food group is quote unquote bad for you, right? It is more about the frequency and your overall patterns of eating, exercise, sleep, etc., that are going to really determine your health and how you feel in and out.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Shannon, for joining us today. And I really hope that this information resonated with somebody. Where can they reach you if they wanted to connect?
Yeah, you can either find me on my website, hangrynutrition, .net, or you can send me a DM on Instagram, Hangry Nutrition or Hangry Shan, and my email is there as well. So any one of those ways. But Hangry Nutrition, if you search that in Google, you should find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Amanda.